Anyways, Samuel Beckett, from his poem Worst Word Ho, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Welcome to the Anatomy of Therapy. I'm Dr. John Cybulski here with Bobby Briley, and today we're talking a little bit about failure, but a little bit about change. How can you make a change in your patients, really? What is it that makes a difference with your patients? I think Bobby has a pretty good angle on this. We're going to get into it via RPE. And I want to let Bobby kind of explain a little bit more, but how do you make changes with your patients? How do you make changes in Tupac changes? What does RPE have to do with this, Bobby?
Well, if you're unfamiliar with RPE, it just stands for rating or rate of perceived exertion. So it's just a score. It's a score that, personal trainers or physical preparation specialists will often use to, or people who are training themselves as a point to guide their training in some way. And it's depicting effort, essentially. So what you perceive your effort to be on a certain movement or activity, right? So 0 to 4, you can think of it almost like warm-up stuff. 4 to 6, you can kind of think moderate activity or maybe endurance activity. And it's really, that 6 to 10 where you're talking about stronger effort, where, something like a 7 might be, you could only do 3 more reps of something. 10 is all out. It's, it's a sprint essentially under 10 seconds. It's like a max lift. It's a 1 rep max. It's Olympic lift, things like that. So
yeah, I heard, not to interrupt. So there are a couple, like the 0 to 10 scale. If you were on a 0, you would be able to do 10 reps. And say that if your perceived RPE was at like an 8, you would be like, well, I can do about 2 more reps left. And I know that there is another version of that runners use, and that some runners hate the description of RPE, and it's on a weird scale from 6 to 20. And you would just add a 0 to it to talk about your heart rate. So 60 beats a minute being kind of the normal threshold, and there's already problems with that. But basically, some runners do RPE in terms of like what's your perceived between 6 and 20, which it throws their scale off immediately. It's kind of weird. But if your perceived between 6 and 20 was 12 out of 6 to 20, they would say generally your heart rate would be at 120 beats per minute. That's another way that people use it. That's really not the direction we're going to go, though, right?
No, not really. And even that reps idea, I think that comes more from programming. Because often, the standard way we program is you do 5 sets at 80% of your 1 rep max.
Right.
And then maybe the next week it's 5 sets of 85% and then 90%, or you might drop your weights. It's a way to calculate your progression using percentages.
Right.
But some people, way less common would be to do the same thing with an RPE scale. So 5 sets at an 8, an RPE.
Okay.
Now, so to quantify, well, what's an 8? They give you that idea of like, okay, you have 2 reps left in the tank every time. So you don't count your reps. You just think I could do about 2 more, and then you rack the weight, right? That would be, but that's not really, I think when it first started, it was more of a subjective thing that was just meant to give you a bit of a guide of where your level of effort's at. And that's kind of what I want to talk about more, is this subjective experience of effort. And so when when we have injuries, it's usually this bell curve. Typically, if we're not talking about traumatic injuries where somebody takes your knee out in football, if we're talking about, slow onset injuries, overuse injuries, nagging injuries, nobody touched you, it just came on over time. There's usually a bell curve that describes this. So you have on the left tail, you have the people who don't really do anything. And then you have the bubble in the middle of the graph, which basically is where people are doing a moderate amount of activity, not too much, not too little, and they do quite well. And then you have the tail on the right side of the graph, which would be too much, right? So what inspired me to discuss RPE and maybe this idea of rate of perceived exertion is that I think most of the time people are on the left side of that curve. Now, it might be different. I would say in Iceland,
most of the time while people are just living or working out or rehab.
I would say just people's lives in general are on the left side of that curve. Too little. And I even wrote down here just life and work and everything, like too little, and too little movement in your day, too little activities, too little responsibility, too little, everything. I would say we're on the left side. And I would still say, even in Iceland, that's still the case, but Icelanders are kind of, can be a bit myopic and crazy, and they can often be on the right side of that curve. There's a reason why of the strongest men in the world that come from Iceland, and these CrossFitters that come from Iceland. And it's because they have a very addictive personality, and they're very, I don't know, they're very all in on things. It's hard to explain, but for a micro community of 300,000 people, they push the things that they're interested in. But even here, I would still say the person who comes into my office most likely is on the left side of that curve. And in the States, I would say more often left side of the curve. Unless you work with a specific population of ultra runners or something, you're probably going to be on the right side of the curve. Now, why does that matter with the RPE? My point in focusing on people on the left side of that curve is this idea of are they and are you as the clinician providing enough stress for them to change, which is what you let off in your introduction, right? We want to change something.
Yeah.
But are we providing enough stress clinically? And are they providing enough stress daily? Spina recently had a podcast where somebody asked him, this is not on his podcast, on a different one, I think, but somebody asked him, like, how does he work on himself? And he was like, thank you for asking. Nobody actually ever asked that. They just ask about his system. But he was saying he thinks of things in 24 hours. So like if he's working on his hip, how much can he get in 24 hours? So even if he's, he didn't say this, but I'm assuming he's working on his hip when he's working with clients. He's working on that hip when he's cooking, or he's doing his cars in the morning and at night. Like he's saying, throughout this whole day, I am trying to get some change going on in this hip. And that also goes in this idea of he's trying to create enough stress adaptation to force a change in his body. And I think we don't even come close to that when we give people 3 sets of 5. And we also don't we don't ask them questions like, what was your RPE on that? And how relative is your RPE to maybe my RPE or a world-class athlete, or somebody who's, you could take a Navy SEAL who knows what pain is really like, or somebody who's, who comes into your office and just stoically tells you that their pain is a 10. Like, yeah, I have it. It's a 10. Like, no, it's not. So, you know what I mean? It's so relative that, yeah.
So how many opinions out there are there in the world, really? I also think that a lot of doctors, when they do give physical therapy and rehab, are still on the bottom end, the left end of that curve. Now, they might find maybe some novel ways in the rehab room to introduce some stress, but I would say the vast majority of musculoskeletal healthcare providers, physiotherapists, chiropractors, and PTs, right, still land on the bottom end of that curve. They've just found novel ways, like let's lay on the side and do a clam, or let's give you some weird grip work, and kind of just some different ways that, because they look weird, I don't think they put in a lot of what you're saying, strain or stress or load, to get a higher RPE. Now, when you say like a higher RPE, like perceived, exertion, how much perceived exertion do we really need for a change? Or if you're on one end of the bell curve, do we need to get to the other? Where do we go with that?
That's a good question. I would usually say the answer, like a broad sweeping answer, would be say the answer involves volume. Usually, sometimes it's load, like actual weight. But the RPE of 8, like you mentioned, you could still do 2 more reps. That's an 8. Well, if you did 18 reps, but you still feel like you could do 2 more reps, that's still an 8.
Okay.
So
That makes sense.
a lot of times volume is what they're missing. There's true volume. And I think that's what Spina was saying with, if he's trying to make a change in a joint or something, he wants to spend just as much time as you can get in a day on this thing.
Yeah.
Because he's saying that that time, or that time under tension, if you will, time of activity makes a difference, right? So a lot of times it's volume, sometimes it's load, but it's also effort. Effort is this, like, it's in between. It covers both of those, right? You can say your effort is or your RPE is a 10 on a 1 rep max, and you could probably say it's a 10 on if 315 for, like, after you set the bar down to 315 for 10, and then you just fall out of the squat rack, that's also a 10. So, I mean, it can be load, it can be volume.
Yeah.
But I think, I've made a little mark here on my paper where I wrote overtraining equals piriformis syndrome. And what I meant by that actually is I think overtraining is rare, just like I think piriformis syndrome is overdiagnosed.
Sure.
That's what I was trying to say. It's not like overtraining equals piriformis syndrome, although it very well can.
Sure.
It's that I rarely see people overtraining. I mean, if you're a high level gymnast, you probably are on that right side of that curve for sure,
Yeah.
or a high level CrossFitter. But we're talking about the left side of the curve, and I would say that it's not a perfect bell curve. You know what I mean?
Of course.
That left side, I think, is much higher than those people that truly push. And there's been other people that have talked about this idea of we always have to be drinking water, and we have to have so much nutrition so we don't dehydrate ourselves. And some of these doctors who study this are like, it's really, really hard to be truly dehydrated.
Yeah.
Which you might be tired and you might be lacking something, but to truly be dehydrated it's very, very difficult to go into that level.
Right.
So that's, and again, these subjective experiences have results, or lack of results.
Sure. So I'm thinking just back into the clinic or back into the gym for like how we can kind of apply this idea. So like I get the question often, okay, that's a good exercise. How many reps do I do? And maybe one day I would be like, okay, 3 sets of 10. That's always what you do. 3 sets of 10. That's where the research says to live. Why is that response not the right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that's the point that made me think of this idea, was me just in the gym myself, looking around and maybe watching people do the same thing week in and week out. They come in, they set their stair climber to 25 minutes at level 5, and it's standard operating procedure. And, they do the same tricep push down, they do the same bench press, same weights, maybe if they feel good, they go up in weight or something. Or even worse is the people that just go straight up to their 1 rep max. And then once they establish that max, they move on to other exercises, and not supplementary exercises, just totally different exercises,
right,
and wonder why they're not building on anything. So, I mean, I wrote down my rule. If there's a rule takeaway for this that's connected to this idea of being, rate of perceived exertion, effort on these things, dealing with pain, non-traumatic, is take whatever the problem is, some nagging knee pain, some disruptive shoulder pain, and train that area specifically, and train it more, increase your effort, your volume, your load, all of it, as long as you can do it without pain. And you said this in the past, like there's pain and then there's pain. You do it better. But I mean, true sharp pain.
right.
If there's sharp pain, you got to back off. You can't do that activity. But often I have a guy, we talked about him already, with a just terrible shoulder.
Yeah.
And I still have him loading that thing. But it's a bunch of isometrics in different positions, because he can do that without pain. So that's fine.
Yeah.
But I needed him to do tons of these isometrics, so he's getting load in there. So the point is you have this little achy knee. Chances are, if you're doing 10 sets of 10 of leg extensions and knee flexion, hamstring curls, and maybe some lunges, and you can do these things without pain, and you're on the left side of that bell curve, I'm not saying it's going to work every time. I'm saying most of the time you'll solve your problem or your patient's problem by training that area. You know, these rotator cuff issues, if they just had more pliability and strength and durability, they wouldn't get so pissed off every time that you bench, because you only bench and you're irritating your AC joint or your supraspinatus or whatever your imbalance is. And lastly, before I kick it back to you, you know, there's also this internal and external loading, right? So I don't mean just external load. If you go internal load, you're thinking more of the FR guys, you know, doing joint movement from within. So, you know, joint rotations and joint PNF stuff, anything to create freedom of that joint so that you can pain-free load it. You know what I mean? Because often you need more of that work as well. We discussed this with a gymnast once where I said, how much work are you doing on that shoulder, specifically that shoulder? And she said, none. So I'm not surprised that shoulder is not letting go. Yeah.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. I think the other perspective into the perceived exertion is that some people have an exercise. You were talking about like a tricep pull down, right? And you can do tricep pull downs and not perceive exertion in your tricep. The amount of weight, your form, the way you do it, you cannot. I mean, I think part of it, the perception of exertion, implies that there is a specifically targeted area, right? I know the runners would kind of think about their heart rate like we talked about earlier, but I've been trying to almost save some of these frowned upon old school PT exercise like I's, Y's, and T's, or the traditional rotator cuff ones. I know we've kind of talked about those. If I can find a range with, let's just say, external rotation, controlled ER, where they do feel that posterior rotator cuff, the back of their shoulder, and they can perceive an exertion there, and they're just doing the last 15 degrees of ER over and over, I think that's a win. So that they're just getting a bunch of blood exertion and they are perceiving a particular area. That's the whole thing with any exercise, really. You can get these very cool, awesome itoportal flow exercises on the ground. But specifically in clinic, or if you're trying to change the way that your body looks or works, you need to perceive it in a specific area, and you need to perceive it exerting. And then I believe with the last place you're kind of talking about is going to that upper limit. That's how I kind of perceive a change happening. Is that fair?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I like that. I think I don't want to misconstrue the idea that if you have shoulder pain and you're typically somebody that does bench press all the time, that you should increase your RPE in a sense on bench press. I mean, think more locally, or in the suburbs of that area, right? If you have elbow pain, think arm, and and focus on some local stuff. That's why I rarely. It's funny because sometimes I think sometimes make fun of like clams, or we make fun of IR and ER banded stuff. And that's usually because people just throw them at everyone. But there is a use for those things. Sometimes we just need load in the tissue and volume, and then we get tissue adaptation, and that adaptation allows you to handle a new level of load, and that makes pain go away. Okay. But if you're getting some joint pinching pain or sharp pain, you have to clear that out first before you can do it. So that's where, we're talking mainly to clinicians here. So this should be easy to understand. If you have this closing pinchy pain, that's something that you have to educate the patient. Like, we can't go into that range yet until we clear that out. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, let's still train that shoulder a ton in any range that we can without sharp or serious, discomfort.
There is something you taught, any range you can. I want to go a little bit further into that. You were talking about a possible Instagram post. Follow us on Instagram. Tell your friends. But to explain that, so like I had mentioned maybe I was doing an exercise and I felt it was the same targeted muscle group. I was talking about my biceps. And I was working my biceps like this, and I worked my biceps like in a different angle, basically, but the same bicep, and I was completely weaker. what was your idea about kind of training through ranges of motion? Because I think that's a great example of what you were talking about, the tricep one.
The tricep one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the discrepancy. Well, I mean, you were telling me that often the way you like to train is to find your weakness,
Right.
which I think is counterintuitive. And actually, what most people don't do, they train their strength.
Mm.
You don't usually like to bench if you're a terrible bench presser, because it's just not really that rewarding, to be honest. So people tend to just overdo their strengths. But what I was saying was, like, there's been times where myself, or I've noticed it in others, who can maybe bench 350 pounds, but doing one dip was painful. And it just means that you're
Right.
kind of playing with fire there, because it means your shoulder and elbows and all your, your triceps and your pectoralis muscles and all these muscles that are really contracting can only do it in a certain way. And if you play with that range at all, it can be catastrophic. So this is where you get pec tears and tricep tears and these things. I mean, if somebody can bench 315 for reps, but they have a problem doing dips without pain, elbow pain, pec pain, I think it's just a matter of time before you tear something, because it's telling me that the amount of tightness, the amount of directionality that your body works in is so specific to a certain task that you don't have any variability. And it's variability that creates athleticism. So if you can, what you want to do is I was mentioning doing tricep work in shoulder extension, in shoulder anatomic position, and in shoulder flexion. So for example, if you wanted to do triceps in shoulder extension, you could do dips, you could do hands back on a bench, body weighted dips, or plates on your thighs if you want. You could do like kneeling or like knee on a bench, tricep kickbacks. If you want to do neutral grip, you just think, or neutral shoulder, you just think tricep pull downs, just standing there like a cable. And then if you want to do something where shoulder flexion, you can think overhead cable tricep extensions, or a French press where you're on your back. You're on your back and you're, like a skull crusher. Yeah. Exactly. French press just means with like a preacher curl bar, I think.
Right.
So, and being able to create power or speed too. Speed is actually, I don't really want to change the topic of this podcast episode, but being able to generate power and also speed. And sometimes you can do one and you can't do the other. And that's also sketchy, because it means maybe creating a fast contraction is not something that your body's used to, and that can cause an injury, or also load itself. So being able to create speed or power from all different positions is a pretty good sign of some shoulder health, or tricep health, or muscle health.
For sure. No, I love that idea. And I was just saying how I've been also trying to give some of that tricep work, either triceps in extension, triceps through neutral or overhead into flexion, specifically with elbows. I find elbows can be a little tricky to fix. However, if we can get a tricep to start working, and then I was using these kind of, again, back to my ER idea of like end range stuff, just some kind of some minimal 15 degrees up and down flexion extension, just pumping some blood, just getting some tension into that elbow in a safe way to, like you said, kind of create that adaptation.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, the FR guys, they're all about, training in these 15-degree ranges, because your body can kind of hold strength or adaptation in 15-degree increments of strength. So, you can train the body in 15-degree movement patterns, at least, so you train it at 60 degrees, and you train it at 75, right, and at 90, and so there's there's different ways that you're talking about it. But I mean, just being able to apply directionality in different positions is probably smart.
There was one other thing I think to kind of cover this, but you were talking about where pain happens, how pain happens. You were kind of talking about low backs, I think. You're talking about people that don't really move in a particular way. Like, I was just thinking of someone with low back pain and kind of standing all day. Like, I have a nurse that stands and works at her nurse station, and then she goes home and, stands and cooks. And that's just a nightmare for her back. And we introduced a little bit of spinal flexion and gave her kind of some strength and some ranges. But her range of pain basically is upright. Like the low back is really not moving forward and back. I mean, if it goes 15 degrees, that's a lot during the course of her day. She's mostly only standing. What were you were kind of talking about? You think that, I'll let you finish it, but you think that pain kind of happens in areas where a lot of range doesn't occur?
Remember,
Because we've
I
talked
think
about
the
the
last
fifth.
time I think I said something like, there's no such thing as bad posture. There's just postures that you're stuck in or that you can't
Right.
get out of. But I would say it's usually, again, it's a bell curve, and you could say there's issues usually with people on the left side where there's no movement, there's no segmentation of the spine, or there's people on the right side where there's too much movement. And depending upon the joint in the body, it'll give you different, so probably for low backs, it's more of the left side of the curve, right? Often you can have basically, the spine, I think Stuart McGill calls these hinges or hinge points.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about this before.
Check out the
Where you'll
hinges
have maybe,
episode.
you'll have 3 or 4 segments that really don't segment or dissociate from each other. And then you'll have one segment that moves a ton. And often at these hinge points, you'll find issues. So it could hurt in the stiff area, it could hurt in the hinge points. But the point is that you have a bunch of stiff segments followed by a hinging segment. If you fix that, it'll fix all the issues. So it doesn't really matter, where the pain is. That's why I said I can tell people I don't always know where your pain is going to be. It's kind of irrelevant sometimes where the pain is. Not always, but sometimes.
Is this, and I want to do an episode on this, but we'll wrap this up here, but is this where the argument, movements over muscles? Because I was thinking about that, muscles versus movements over muscles. And I think it gets distorted pretty quickly. But I think there are some of those 15-degree steps you can kind of go in terms of it. Like I was thinking about your pec guy, your guy that's doing a bench press. He could bench press 315 for reps, but then can't do a dip without a lot of strain. It just doesn't make sense. Clearly, he has worked one specific movement, the bench press movement, and a very specific set of muscles through that movement. But those muscles don't then translate to a different movement. So in the bench press one, the movement and muscles are one. When he switches over to the dip, then those muscles can't do the movement.
Or without pain. Yeah.
Or versus the pain, correct.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying as well? Or so what is the difference between the movement versus the muscle, or the muscle versus the movement in this sense? Because I think a lot of times we're getting confused with the work and the movement. People are like, never do those stupid post rotator cuff ones.
I think it's just an issue of positionality. Like, so there's just position and there's total joint capacity. So
okay, I like that. You
know what I mean? So these guys that have been benching for years, they know exactly how to set their shoulders, how to bend the bar, how to keep, and then they don't even have to have their elbows tracking in the same width from their thorax. They'll have their own custom position that each shoulder's in, and that's fine. And they groove that pattern, and they can get away with that pattern usually, and sometimes it breaks. But that's, and then you go put the shoulder in a different position where maybe you need more IR of the shoulder, or you need more ER of the shoulder, or the elbow joint, or at the wrists. And then now the chain doesn't pull right because you have joints that are not working together, right? You don't have the capacity of each joint from your fingers to your wrist, to your elbow, to your shoulder, to your thorax. It doesn't allow those things to synergistically work together to create a power without an issue. Sure. And I mean, not to put you on the spot, and of course I have the right answer, but when I think of elbow pain, typically what part of the body do you think is connected to the reason why most people have elbow issues? Do you think it's the elbow?
Do I think the elbow is the reason for elbow issues? Rarely.
What did you? Okay, so I'll give you multiple choice. Okay, so is it the elbow? Is it the shoulder? Is it the big toe? Or is it the thorax?
See, I like to say the thorax because that was a very special episode to me recently, and you should go listen to it. But okay, so but how? Help me. How does the
Okay,
thorax relate to my elbow?
it is
How?
thorax.
Yes.
The point is, if you're doing barbell curls,
Hmm.
and we're a little off topic already, but it's great.
I know.
If you're doing barbell
Shocker.
curls and your thorax is, let's say, rotated to the right, or it's positioned to the right, just for an example, you rotate better right, everything is easier to the right. It's oriented to the right. It's going to be a lot easier for you to supinate that arm. Okay. So if you're trying to supinate your other arm, you're going to have a lot of stress going through your elbow compared to the other side. So that's what I'm only using it as an example to say your thorax, in my opinion, dictates most issues with elbows, because elbows don't have as much freedom of movement as a shoulder does. Shoulders can compensate like crazy,
Right.
but elbows really don't compensate that very well. That well, it's kind of like knees. They're mainly hinge joints. They have some rotational aspects, of course, but elbows don't handle a lot of that shear or rotational force very well. Sure. And those muscles that attach there, if they're not used to that type of force, they don't really like it either. So my point being is that the position of the shoulder, the position of these joints, if they're not able to comfortably get into a position and fire, you're going to have issues, right? Going back to the bencher doing dips, or for the person doing barbell curls, they can maybe do hammer curls just fine, or they can do single, dumbbell in each hand. They can do supinated curls, but then as soon as you lock them into a bar, now you have to have good symmetry in your body to be good. This is why fixing people's, uneven hips or asymmetrical hip issues usually aren't fixed very well by a barbell squat with 2 feet on the ground.
Sure.
Or, if you want to fix shoulders and pecs, it's probably not great to fix them to a bar and a bench press, because you're not able to dissociate anything. Now you got to have symmetry. Otherwise you're going to be, in trouble.
I fully agree. You sent me one quick thing, and then I'm bringing it back to RPE, and then we can finish. You sent me an awesome post the other day about gait. And a fellow was talking about when the foot hits the ground and the myth of adduction at the leg, and how as soon as your foot hits the ground, you get adduction of the leg. You don't need to work. Anyways, it was a whole post. However, the gist of the post was that there is a natural order of how things work through the gait cycle. There is this series of things. If you want a good example of it, and we'll get him back on slowly, is the sports physio, Zach, talks about these chains of muscles really, really well, and all the things that kind of fire together. And his exercises kind of reflect that. With the elbows, my friend Zach Couples taught me one time, that he got from another course, but that supination, I'm going to mess it up, but like you can feel if you pronate one arm and supinate the other, that your rib cage will also kind of follow, right? So like pronation on the right and supination on the left would cause left side bending and right opening, right? Adduction on the right, and vice versa. If you were to turn, you can just do it right now as you're listening, not in the car, but if you're turning your right arm into, anyways, dear God, I'm brain farting hard.
If you supinate your right arm,
yes,
your chest should follow it, right? As you're pronating your left hand.
You'd be rotating to the right or side bending to the right. Anyways, these things go together naturally. However, what happens through some of these pain cycles is that we have rewired a certain movement for a particular adaptation. Like my nurse at the desk, she's always reaching off to the right to grab the phone. And so she's just got this new movement pattern that may not mimic her pronation, supination, interrotation, and abduction of that corresponding thorax. And so she could get a break in that pattern and create a new kind of torque. Now, going back to the kind of gait thing, we resync that stuff up. The Zach Kogans of the world try to start off that initial thing. However, if you don't want to mimic gait all day, you can go back to RPE. You can think about perceived exertion, find the tissue that has a maladapted. And I also want to make an argument for maladaptation. Their body, there is no such thing. The body is just trying to protect itself. It's actually a good adaptation. It just functionally means in relation to something else, just doesn't fit. So now that she's reaching for the phone on the right, the outside of her elbow is hurting. That doesn't mix when she's trying to cut carrots at the end of the day to feed her family, right? So I now need to put a new novel, non-painful stimulus into her elbow in relation to her shoulder and a grip. And I can kind of think about that now in terms of RPE, where we can put some good positive load into that arm and tell the elbow, yo, it's okay to move. It's okay to cut carrots. It's okay to grab the phone at work. But we need to put a new novel stimulus in there and move the needle so that we get a change in the stimulus. Am I learning this correctly? I think I am.
Yeah, on that idea of, the Zach Couples and everything, like he takes a lot of stuff from Bill Hartman as well, and like the iFast group, and that's a great group to follow if you want to look at Mike Robertson, Bill Hartman, where you can functionally train something in a way. Let's say you want to do bicep curls because you like your biceps and you like to bodybuild, but how about doing them in ways that actually increase capacity of joints or get the body to work together, like John was talking about. So those are great ways to go look at different ways where you can, rotate a thorax to a certain side while you train the bicep or the tricep, not just in neutral all the time or wherever your body positions itself in its scoliotic environment that it gets into, which everybody is in some form scoliotic, the way that they're not balanced side to side.
Right.
But then there's the other side of it. There's like a functional, like positional based training, but then there's just load in general. So that's like my elevator speech from the beginning, RPE. My elevator speech would basically be, I only know this because I struggle with this. It's not like I'm preaching from like a soapbox. I'm saying often I will realize that the amount of load I'm giving is not commensurate with what they need to improve. And it's almost like a slap, like hit yourself in the head. Like, of course, this would not be enough to create an adaptive process or change in this person. Like, why did I think that would be enough? Well, it's because something I've tried before. It's something in a textbook, something I learned from a course. But then sometimes when you get down to it, you look at it, you're like, oh, and I'll tell this to patients because they'll say, well, they might think some of this stuff is, when I do it correctly anyway, when I give the proper volume, they say, wow, this seems like a lot. And I said, well, if you go in the gym and you take a dumbbell off and you curl it 3 times and you do it for 2 sets and then you get in your car and drive home, don't look in your mirror anytime soon to see any changes in those arms, right? There's a threshold that will create change. And it's no different from rehab. There's zero difference in what tissues adapt to, right? So if you take a marathon runner and you just tell them to run a nice, easy 5K, they're actually deconditioning that day. They're going down because to them, that's a joke, right? So it depends on the goals. But my takeaway would, again, just be the real simple thing would be, where they have an issue, can you train that issue without pain or improve joint function without pain? And can you get them to slowly increase that volume linearly with what they can tolerate because of their time or their schedule or their RPE or their, how much they're willing to do, right? And I think that would fix 70%. It's probably Pareto rule, maybe 80% fixed by this thing by itself.
For sure.
And then those 20% need to be fixed by the wizards of, Haruska and Hartman and Spina and these people who really can go in there and say, it's because of this, and we need to do very specific work for you. Right.
The vast majority of people, though, I agree. You can go through the 15-degree range rule and find some 15-degree movement or 15-degree range within that movement of that painful joint that is non-painful, and you can find a window. That would be my only thing that I would add into it, just to give some hardcore. Find 15 degrees somewhere through external or internal rotation and help them load that. And then systematically, once they experience that load, open up the 15 degrees on either side. And all of a sudden you got 30. Then all of a sudden you got 45. All of a sudden you double that and you got 90 on either side. And you have a full range of motion. At least even giving the expectations to a patient to be like, look, we've got this 15 range. I need you good. I need you strong. I need you to hammer this range, because there's 15 degrees on either side that, by the way, triple our range of motion of safe and pain-free. Kind of explaining that to patients. Honestly, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because sometimes I will overcomplicate my rehab. I'll throw the same things. I'm guilty of it for sure. This is a facepalm emoji already. But I feel like
it could be brilliant, right? It's a brilliant, and they do need it, but it could be underloaded. It's just not creating an adaptation, or there's not enough volume. And like one little anecdote, like before we go, is just think about a period. Most people have some period in their life where they trained hard, right? Like, I mean, I used to do MMA, and 2 hours of rolling, like doing King of the Hill on the mat, is like, you just want to vomit for the next 2.5 hours after you leave the gym, for me. So there's that. And there's now my cardio is like jogging for 15 minutes. And I'm like, woo, that was I had a CrossFitter make fun of me the other day, because she was like, you call that your cardio, Right. And well, it is right now. So my point with this little anecdote is, you used to think that was training. Right? You used to be a runner. I'm talking to the people listening. You used to play football. You used to play soccer. You used to be a heavy lifter. And now you don't do those things. Now going to the gym and just doing your bodybuilding workout, or going for a 5K, at a 145, 150 heart rate, just seems like a big deal. I think we sometimes have to remind ourselves of this relativeness of whatever phase we're in. If you take somebody very obese or very metabolically challenged, just walking upstairs is intensely uncomfortable. Right. But often there's people that are healthy and fine, or essentially could be healthy, but they've lost sight of what effort actually looks like. You know what I mean? And this can be in all areas of life. But it's even in training, where you perceive a certain thing, but then you realize, and I remember Jordan Peterson said, every now and then you come across deficient people from time to time, and you have no idea how efficient people can be. In other words, he was saying how efficient they can get. It's exponential. It's unbelievable. It's off the charts, he's saying. So I think sometimes it's a good reminder to say, to maybe reevaluate what you think is actually stress or load. Yeah.
I love that. I thought you were going to go into the Jordan Peterson, Peter Pan one. Maybe we'll save that for another podcast. But I love it, man. I'm inspired. I've got all sorts of new ideas for my patients now. I hope you guys do too. Please tell a friend. Please give us 5-star rating on iTunes. Those ratings really do help us. We appreciate it. We appreciate you. Bobby, you know what? I appreciate you, buddy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. It's really good stuff today. It's actually, I like this one a lot, man. But thank y'all for listening. Subscribe, give us 5 stars, and we'll talk to you next time. Peace.
Au revoir.